شكرا لك. الله يرفع درجاتكم. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Inshallah, we begin our weekly reflection on healthy relationships focused on couples. And we said that we were using this book by Rachel Chapman, and we have been using it because it provides a basic outline using some counseling points and relationship principles, but we also add things from Islam as far as principles are concerned. And there's things here that are common to every human. There's some things that we don't agree with as Muslims. That's why it's necessary to, when we read, we make sure that we have an understanding of that which may be problematic. Today we enter into chapter 4, which talks about the issue of improving communication. Improving communication. So if we remember, we first started with the issue of listening effectively. And so basically what she was talking about was the concept of active listening. So what that means is that the relationship, if it's going to be healthy, is based on communication. And that communication, the core of it, is that we learn how to listen to each other. And so part of listening to each other is giving full attention to what the other person is saying without thinking necessarily about what is it that we want to comment on what they said, or refute what they said, or interrupt what they said. If anything, what we would do is ask for them to clarify something that they communicate. And what that does in that process, where we're actively listening, we're not distracted by the phone, or we're not necessarily staring into space, or we're not focused on some other thing. We're focused only on the person. And we actually are showing with our body language, and with when we ask questions, it pertains to what the person says. We just want to clarify. You know what I'm saying? Can you explain this to me? Can you share this with me? I necessarily didn't understand. Is this what you mean? That type of language. What that does is that gives us the ability to connect with the person. That gives us the ability to connect with the person, and the person is clear that we are there with them present, and we're connecting with them spiritually, and we're connecting with them emotionally. The other thing that came up after that was the issue of how do we deal with conflict? Resolving and preventing conflict within communication, arguments, pretty much. And so she outlined some things, and of those things was not to attack each other, not to bring up the past, right? Not to use language which is problematic. Those are some of the core issues that she brought up. But this is, for the most part, what we see in couples when they have relationships that are problematic. They're talking to each other with bad language. They're attacking each other. They're disrupting each other. They're bringing up the past. They're screaming at each other. All those things she said are problematic in communication, and it breaks it down, and it doesn't allow us to connect or even understand each other. That's why the active listening was important. Then in chapter 3, she talked about the issue of accepting and sharing opinions. And we talked about how this overlaps with the concept of shura in Islam, or mutual consultation, which is a Quranic concept. And we also mentioned that, unfortunately, the concept of shura, which should be central in our lives with one another, is something that has been missing in the ummah at the level of the family, at the level of institutions, at the level of the political for a very long time. You have some pockets in which shura was practiced, but in terms of the family, if the family is ever going to be representative of the Quranic values for building an ummah, there's certain values that the Quran puts forward, such as the issue of supporting and aiding one another, ta'awun. But what kind of supporting and aiding one another? Al-bir wa taqwa, which basically, to simplify, is in that which is good in its various levels. The commands of Allah Ta'ala and going beyond that. And so there's also the issue of shorter that comes into that. So that family has to be rooted in those Quranic values. The issue of wanting islah. Islah is to ameliorate, to bring better conditions when the situations in the family go wrong. We want to better the situation. We don't want to keep escalating the conflict and make it a point of war between husband and wife or family members and so on and so forth. So the idea of accepting and sharing opinions, at the root of that is that we have to respect the other person and want to listen. If we don't value the other person and they're sharing their opinion, and that's especially, we have to be careful with this issue when it comes to us as Muslims, because we confuse the concept of qawwama, men are the maintainers and protectors of women. We confuse that for meaning that the men are the sole authority and no one else is to speak or listen. That's not what that means. That's a distorted meaning and understanding. If you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his interaction with his family, you'll get a clear understanding of how it is that the people navigated. You get a clear understanding of how it is that he related to his wives and his wives related to him. You get a clear understanding of that. That doesn't need a lot of tafsir and this, that. As a matter of fact, we have problems sometimes when we go to the books of tafsir to understand what it is that's being said about the role of the man. Because the books of tafsir, which are supposed to clarify the meanings of the Quran, are not equivalent to the Quran. So a lot of times they will be shaped by what it is that's happening in their time period. And so you will find that if you go back to the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and that time period, there's more liberation of women and more freedom and more justice and equity and all of that than you sometimes find in what it is that some of the scholars are saying. That doesn't mean we don't cherish or we don't value or we don't respect what some of the scholars are saying. But what we're saying is that we can't always, and we can't always just assume that it's correct, and we should never equate it exactly with the Quran or the prophetic example, because now we're in the realm of opinion of the human being. And of course, that's supposed to be the realm of the scholars to clarify that and so on and so forth. But when we have a type of scholarship that's just imitating what was said, and they're not thinking through what is said, and they're not looking to see, does this really embody, does it reflect the principles of the Quran itself, and does it reflect the prophetic practice? When that's not being done, then we have an issue. So how can in one ayat we have the issue of human dignity, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, and then when we come to the issue of الرِّجَالُ قَوَّمُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ, that men are supposed to be the ones that are protectors and maintainers, which I'll get a little bit into that issue in a minute. Then we totally wipe out the voice of the woman, and we wipe out the standing of the woman, and we have a command of the Quran, شَوَّرَهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, شَوَّرَهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. That the Quran is commanding us to make shura. And we talked about that in other sessions and so on and so forth. How at first the Quran described the believers, أَمْرَهُمْ شُورَ بَيْنَهُمْ, that their affair is consultation, a mutual consultation. And then when that was not practiced, the command came to make it clear that it's not just the issue of what? It's not just the issue of recommendation or you just leave it. The Quran made it a command. It made it an obligation. شَوَّرَهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. And so that, has to be a reality by which we We're talking about the issue of consultation in that regard, or mutual consultation, and the value of the woman has to be in place. So when we look at the issue of qawama, we have to be careful how we're dealing with that concept, because it doesn't mean dictatorship. It doesn't mean to imitate Pharaoh. It's to imitate the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not Pharaoh. So Pharaoh was the one that took life from everyone. He felt as though he's the one on top, and so on and so forth. And you have some people, they'll say, Yani, Ana Rabbul Ala. They'll say that, astaghfirullah. They'll say that they're the highest authority that there is in the whole house. And in reality, they don't realize that the issue of qawama is the issue of mas'uliyah. It's the issue of responsibility. To maintain the structure of the household, right? It's not an issue to eliminate the members of the household. Even the children, they should be taught how to express themselves respectfully and properly within the interests of the group. In this society, everybody expresses their opinion, whether it's valuable or not valuable, whether it hurts the group or doesn't hurt the group. They just say whatever they want to say. So you'll have children, they get angry, they'll curse out the parents. You have, the same thing with the teachers and all so on. They don't care, in that regard. Is the issue of expressing opinion without responsibility? That's not what Islam is saying. When we express our opinion, is we're giving it for the well-being, for the goodness. It's supposed to have a purpose. Either to correct the situation, al-amr bil maruf, or to prohibit that which is problematic, and nahy anil munkar. And so the communication piece is extremely important, but that can't take place if we're not looking at the spouse as being, someone that has honor and dignity and is worthy of their opinion being understood. And if there's a difference in education, say for instance, the man is more educated than the woman, then the man has the responsibility, if he's truly educated, of being wise, and you raise that woman's station. It is impossible for her to be stupid, because women, even that don't have education, they have life experiences. Somewhere along the line, in some area, her opinion is going to have weight. And so the more, if we're building a family, we're talking about making sure that we're building the family. If we pass away and die, who's going to be the one to maintain that family? If we're not in the household and the woman is in the household, who's going to be the one to deal with the children? So what type of education is going to go to the children if we're not valuing the woman in that regard? So we have to, that's important, especially from the angle of those cultures that we have in the Muslim community, in which the men have the centrality, that the men have to realize that the position of the woman is one of dignity in Islam. And if we don't have that idea of respecting and honoring the women in their proper place, then what begins to happen is we push them towards feminism in the negative sense. We push them towards all those movements that are out there, which are saying we've come to liberate the woman, and then it becomes a battle of the sexes. We can't continue to afford that type of situation in our households. That's happening to some Muslim communities, some families, where the relationship between the husband and the wife is a battle of the sexes, a battle between the male and the female. It's a fight between them over who should have the authority and who should be in charge, and it's a constant breakdown of communication between them. So sure, men have a responsibility and they have a leadership role, but we have to begin to understand what is that leadership role. The only way that we can properly understand what is that leadership role, because we have so many distorted understandings of leadership within our community and outside of our community, inside the Muslim community and in the society, we have to look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Right? And so that's extremely important. So she says here, communication is the most important building block of every relationship. Every relationship outside of the family, that's the major issue that we have with each other in the general community. That's the issue that parents have with their children. That's the issue that friends have with one another. That's the issue of those that want to get married to one another that they have. That's the issue of the husband and the wife. That's the issue of the siblings. The issue that communication is not in its proper place. As a matter of fact, in the age of what we call the age of communication, which is social media and all that, there's massive misunderstanding between people. So it would seem that the tools would be there to help us to communicate, but no, the communication is not in place. It's not so our relationships with one another suffer because of that. And so she says, that communication suffers. And once it suffers, it leads to poor listening and as well as arguments and conflicts between partners. So poor communication, it leads to unhappy and unhealthy relationships. And then she says that's something that no one deserves. That's true. That's true because the goal of marriage is, لِتَسْكُنْ إِلَيْهَا. So in this case, there should be some serenity and peace, and you should be able to be at ease in the household, both male and female. And then there's the issue of mawadda and rahmah. Those are some of the goals of marriage. First of all, the concept of zawj, here is an indication that we are in pairs. So that means we're supposed to be compatible with one another. But it's not enough to just say compatible with one another at a biological level or I'm attracted to you. There's the other issues that we come to know that are the objectives of marriage, like the issue of being in a state of tranquility in the household. The other issue is love and mercy. So that's something that's important. That's not going to take place with bad communication. So nobody deserves to live in an environment in which there's constant insults and war and belittling and you can't express yourself properly or you're misunderstood. That leads to a lot of issues. A lot of issues. And we even say that pushes people outside of the marriage and pushes them towards zina. Because then they're going to look for somewhere else where they can find love and mercy and acceptance and all that type of stuff. So when she says when partners don't openly communicate with one another, the feelings, emotions, and happiness gets distorted. That's true. That's solid. That's a solid position that she is talking about. That is exactly what happens. We see that on a regular basis. When the misunderstanding sets in, the emotions are twisted, and even the concept of happiness gets twisted. And then one of the sisters she's active in Dawah, she was saying that we have to explain when it comes to relationships that also people have to have their own personal happiness, their own personal relationship with Allah Ta'ala. In other words, don't expect your spouse to make you happy 100%. Yes, they should you should feel happy around them, but don't expect, if you're not happy with yourself, with your relationship with Allah, if you're not in a situation where you can express yourself properly, if you don't take those means to be at the best that you can be, don't expect your spouse to stop your misery. You see what I'm saying? And it gets worse. First of all, Dr. Malik Bedri Rahmatullahi alayhi, who he passed away recently, he was one of the top Muslim thinkers that was dealing with Islamic psychology. He talked about the problem of not considering Iman. People think that marriage is you have, the mahar in place or with the dhahab in place, the house in place. You can continue supporting the marriage, and if you can do that, then that's it. But then the side of Iman is missing. Many couples, when they start to have problems and you ask them as a preliminary question, do you two pray together? You find those couples that they don't pray together are some of the ones that have issues. They don't pray together. And you find even if they're praying, say for instance, they pray this, close to the same time, they'll be praying in different areas. And you find more and more that becomes issues. They don't have a spiritual base. So without getting into the issue of superstition, the Quran makes it clear. Shaitan lakum aduwwun mubin. Right? The shaitan is a clear enemy to you. So from the unseen, there's a battle. On top of the issues that we have with ourselves, right? Our own problems, our own frustrations, and so on and so forth. And so how do we deal with that stuff? How do we deal with when our spouses, we don't feel happy in the relationship? How do we deal with when our spouses give us a headache or they give us problems? How are we dealing with that? But the issue is, well, don't fight, that's fine. But are we, it's a rhetorical question to ask, are we dealing with that from the lens of Iman? You see what I'm saying? Or are we dealing with that solely from, but where do we get the idea to make peace from? Aside from the benefiting of the relationship, where do we get the idea to make peace from? That's a skill. But what I'm trying to get you to come to is that the concept of repairing our relationship with one another for us is not just for the sake of the marriage. For us, it's part of Iman. In a general way, we can even say, "Faslahu bayna akhawaykum." In a general way, before even we talk about the marriage, that the conflict between the believers is something that we should resolve, and we should bring about the best conditions that are possible. So conflict resolution in the Quran itself, especially between the believers, is about bringing about the best conditions possible to make the situation better than what it was as much as possible. So then that principle, it comes into the marriage itself, because the brotherhood and the sisterhood of Iman doesn't go away just because there's marriage. And so within the issue, when we have shiqaq, or when we have dissension, you know what I'm saying? We have rules before going to divorce and just, breaking up the relationship. And part of that is that we're trying to make the condition more and more better. But what I'm trying to say here is that the spiritual dimension allow us to be able to be patient with one another as we're going through all these struggles with one another. It allows us to see the benefit of staying together. It allows us to see love. It allows us to see forgiveness. It allows us to keep pushing forward. It's good. And so what you just said is we return back to the prophetic example. We tried to imitate the prophetic example. We have a reference point for, okay, how can we navigate this situation? We have an example of how we can navigate this situation. That's actually what people are doing. Not necessarily from the angle of going back and thinking about the prophetic example of how do we deal with these issues in our relationships. But people go to YouTube, they try to figure out, some example that's given from some counselor, which is fine. That may work to a certain degree. But what we're saying is that Iman, it allows us to be able to deal with our problems and to decrease that burden, right? When we begin to ask Allah, when we begin to see where's their solution, when we begin to try to hold on, if not, we just give up, just move on because it's too much work. You know what I'm saying? So she comes into now the issue of what are some of the barriers to communication. So we added on to that. We said that Iman is important because it gives us the tools, or it gives us the values, or it gives us just the motivation or the emotional, spiritual strength to keep moving on. But the practical side here, okay, how do we deal with the quality of the relationship? And so now, remember, this chapter is how you improve on communication. And one of the things that we're emphasizing, is the necessity of valuing the other person, the necessity of seeing that the other person is a human being, the necessity of seeing that the other person has the right to be heard, the necessity of implementing listening to each other, the necessity of sharing opinions, the necessity of being patient, the necessity of resolving conflict. Those are general ideas. But on a more specific or general principles, on a more specific issue, when we talk about communication, how do we improve it? We have to realize that there's certain things that stop communication from being communication as it should be. So she says, like, for instance, choosing to communicate at the wrong time. That's true. That's where we have to be wise. We have to ask ourselves, is it the right time to communicate? Like, for instance, like we may be coming to communicate with Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala in Salah. So is that the time to take a phone call? No, I'm asking you, is it the time to take a phone call? Right? When the Salah is in, You're communicating with Allah in the salah, right? And Allah is communicating with you. So now a phone call comes in. Is that the time to take the phone call? Is it yes or no? We have enough problems with that with brothers in their phones and so on and so forth. But it's not the time to take, in other words, that's not the time to communicate with that person. Because what's happening there is what needs to happen at that moment. I'm just giving an example of salat by itself, so that we can realize that example can be in our minds. So sometimes even in our communication with each other, it's not the right time to communicate. If I have to go to the bathroom and it's intense that I have to go to the bathroom, is that the time that I sit here and I try to have a discussion with you when I'm frustrated and I have to go to the bathroom? Even when it comes to Islamic practice, when it comes to the etiquette of the judges, adab al-qadi, if the judge didn't eat, or if the judge had, even salah itself, if you're overwhelmingly having to go to the bathroom, then you stop the salah and you go to the bathroom. Why? Because it's a distraction from what it is that you need to do. The same thing when it comes to the qadi not eating or being angry and judging in that state. That affects that person's decision. See what I'm saying? So we can take and we can extract from those practices in Islam that there's a certain time for communicating properly. If we know that we're angry or we're frustrated or we're overwhelmingly exhausted, it's not a time to open up a dialogue on some issues. The same thing if a person is sick or going through a struggle, or if a person's parent just died or they lost their job, it's not the time to communicate on certain issues which are going to compound the situation. That's common sense. But sometimes we don't pay attention to common sense, right? And so she's emphasizing, you know what I'm saying? And so she makes a point here. She says, choosing a time when one or both parties are not emotionally available can be the biggest barrier in between. In other words, you're emotionally not in the mode to be able to deal with that issue. You know, sometimes what happens with this situation, people get overly frustrated. What do? They rush to talaq, to divorce. Why? Because the communication is so frustrated. It shouldn't be a communication which is taking place at that time because the emotions are too high. And a person is trying to express what they want by force in the moment, when it's not the moment to deal with that. This is the moment to calm down and clear the mind. And it continues to escalate emotionally more in tension, and that leads to talaq. Because we're not respecting that fact. That moment is a barrier to proper communication. That's the principle that she wants to weigh in. The principle that she wants to lay down, that there's certain things that stop communication from taking place. This chapter is the chapter on improving communication. So part of understanding how to improve communication is knowing that there's a time and a place for communicating. And we gave different examples of there being a time and a place for things. Right? And so she says, you know, that when trying to have important conversations, always schedule a time for them to be discussed in detail. That's another issue. That there's some situations which need to be communicated with clarity and fullness. So if you're on your way to work, or if you're in the middle of dealing with paying a bill or this, that's not the time to deal with that. Or she's on her way out, you understand? And you're on your way to take the kids to school, and it's an important conversation, and you're bringing it up in that context, which, what she says here, you can't give it full attention. So the issue of listening comes back into play. How is listening to each other, and how is proper communication taking place when there's not respect given to the time itself? It's not appropriate to open up certain conversations at certain times, and we have to be mindful of that. Yeah, we mentioned that before. In other words, from part of a person bettering their practice of Islam, they're bettering themselves and their understanding and practice of Islam, is to know what's the obligation of the moment, not to be distracted with something else. So every time has a job that we have to do in it. And so, for instance, we have to realize that the time for communication, right, especially on serious issues, is a time in which people can be present and full, where they can give full attention, where they're not distracted, where they're in a state of mind where they can give the other person investment and commitment. If not, you're talking about important issues or not even high level important issues. It could be things which are sensitive. In other words, the person is expecting to communicate with you, because they want to spend time with you. That's important. But that's not at the level, for instance, of making a decision about whether to put your child in the hospital or not. But it's still important because that's about maintaining the relationship. So if the person feels that you're not giving them full time, you don't give them attention, you see what I'm saying? In the midst of communicating, that the only thing that you're doing is hanging out with your friends, or you're always on the phone, or you're always on social media, or you're always working. You understand what I'm saying? Mhm. That's a balance, depending on how close you live to the masjid and so on and so forth. That's a balance. But there's, those situations you balance out, or in this type of community, husband and wife can come pray together. There's some communities, husband and wife pray, why husband and wife, they pray together, praying at home together. You see what I'm saying? There's ways to deal with that. It's not that complicated in that regard. Depends on what the situations are and so on and so forth, right? But that is becomes a tension when people have a wrong understanding of the deen, or they have a rigid, narrow understanding. They don't realize how wide Islam is and how you can do things in different ways and so on and so forth. Then what begins to happen is their religious practice impacts on their relationship negatively, right? But that's the issue of what? Shura. That's why, for instance, the husband and the wife, they talk to each other about fasting if it's not an obligatory fast. Why? Because the fasting prevents the husband and wife from being intimate with each other. So the fasting, if it's an obligatory fast, it's not an issue because that's the right of Allah wa ta'ala. But say the person wants to fast Mondays and Thursdays or some other day like that, and it's not an obligatory fast. That's a matter of consulting with each other. I'm gonna fast. What do you think? Why? Because you're taking away the right of the other person to have access to you in intimacy. And it's husband and wife together. It's not just the husband. And so the reality of talking to each other, right? Like sometimes if you're working 10 hours a day or 9 hours a day, and then you're coming to the masjid and then you're spending an hour, that means now you're out of the home like 11 hours. We're not saying don't come to the masjid, but what we're saying is that those types of discussions, that's what we talked about, the issue of communication and the issue of sharing opinions, right? And giving opinions and coming to a conclusion as to how we can navigate our relationship together, especially in issues of spirituality like that. You know what I'm saying? That's important. But space is also important. Sometimes letting a person have their space, you have your space. During that time you come to the masjid, maybe she's visiting her family or her friends for a little bit of time. That gives you the space. Some space is important for the relation. When you're stuck with each other on a regular basis, usually ends up into fights. It's not balanced. It's not healthy to just be locked into the relationship with each other like that. A little bit of space between each other in a healthy way, with healthy influence from the outside, is very productive. It's very healthy. You understand what I'm saying? And when people begin to just only want to be with each other and it becomes controlling, that stuff is unhealthy. But in any event, it also shouldn't be an issue that I'm going to my mom's house and you going to the masjid, and it leads to the point where nobody's spending time with each other, right? And so another thing, that choosing the wrong time to communicate, right? That's the first thing. And before we go to this other thing, choosing the wrong time to communicate is a barrier to actual communication. The other issue that she brings up is us being too judgmental. When listening to what the partner has to say, try not to be too judgmental or picky, or it will make them feel disrespected. So if we're talking about listening, then we're not talking about judging. We're talking about having to understand what the other person is saying. Bringing in judgment of people is a problem in communication, even between friends and teacher and student and general Muslim community. That's not good. Constantly being judgmental, because when you're judgmental, you're not giving yourself the opportunity to even listen. You're just assuming that you understood. And how many times situations have taken place that when you really listen or when you do more investigation, it changes the whole dynamic. I knew a situation where, there's people. There was a brother that was telling me that he didn't see his children. He just let the matter be. He wasn't seeing his children. Part of it had to do with family problems that took place after divorce. So at face value, you listen to that, you're like, how can you not see your children? You know what I'm saying? You look at that, you're like, how can you not see your children? But then when you listen further and you realize, he's not the problem for why he couldn't see the children. It's the mom that didn't let him see the children, so he decided to not make it a fight and suck it up. You see what I'm saying? Versus make it a war. He decided to take that hit emotionally and mentally for the sake of peace, even though that's not what he wanted. That was forced upon him. But at face value, if you're listening, but you're listening with judgment and jumping to the conclusion, right? You can misinterpret where the person is coming from, right? So that's something that's important. So one of you might actually have an important concern to discuss, but judging from the disrespectful attitude, they may decide not to continue in the conversation. The other issue, and we just bring up three more points briefly, and then we'll pause. We'll pause at the point where she talks about signs your communication is good or bad, which is on page 80 of the book. For right now, so we covered the issue of what are the barriers to communication. Number one, choosing the wrong time to talk. Should be aware of when is the appropriate time and give the conversation its due attention and its due respect and the due amount of time. Being too judgmental, that's a big problem, especially when couples are used to fighting each other. Listen, don't be judgmental. Allow the person to communicate. Wait till the partner expresses themselves, and then be careful how you're talking about what it is that they said. You know, make sure you understand. Don't just come to a conclusion or judgment right away. That doesn't mean that in some situations judgment may not be required, but that shouldn't be the habit. Also, being too critical or negative, which is similar to judgmental. When a partner uh, is being negative about all the ideas you have to present, they will stop, communicating to you, with more information, as your unsupportive attitude will make them feel less valid. That's true. We hear that in women all the time. Some brothers, especially, the same thing. When they're faced with the issue of being too critical, the other partner's too critical or negative, that becomes the issue. And another thing is interrupting the person while they're talking, right? That issue. And so it says sometimes the partner is only looking for a means to vent out. In other words, the partner is looking at you, the partner is sharing what it is, the pain or whatever it is that they're going through. They need you to listen. They need to feel that you listen. How do you feel when you ask about this a lot of times and the people cut you off? They know that's your routine, right? So you want them to listen. So the same thing, the same thing in that regard. Sometimes, but this I added on to that. You have to know the person. In other words, you have to be able to tell. Right now, this person they just need to let loose a little bit, share with me. If you don't know the person, then if you're not listening properly, it's hard to know that they're venting. It's hard to know that they're venting. And sometimes we may take it for complaining, but in reality, it's not necessarily complaining. They may actually be hurting deep down inside, and they may be really broken, and that's how they. Sometimes anger comes out like that. That if you pay attention, in reality, the person's not really angry. They're expressing anger, but deep down inside, they're broken and it's coming out like that because they want to hide the fact that they're vulnerable and they're hurt. But if we don't listen and we're not paying attention, it's difficult to pick up on that. Men have to pay attention to that, especially with women, right? Because men usually operate off of a different logical way. Women pick up on mixed messages and they pick up on emotion and this and that. So reading the other person is important. Like, and that's important in order to. But the key here is don't disrupt. Don't have a monopoly over the conversation. Let the person express themselves. It may not be the moment for them to express what they want to express, but you don't do that. Let them express themselves, then continue. Like, bring the person back on topic. Lastly, she says using you statements. In other words, you did this, you did that, it's your fault. You see what I'm saying? That puts the person on the defensive. All of these things, remember, that we're talking about, they're barriers to what? To communication. In other words, they stop the communication, right? And so instead of it being a situation in which it benefits, it becomes a back and forth and a blame game. Why? Because you're saying you're blaming the other person. You this, you that, but you said this, you did that. It becomes an issue, and sometimes it becomes a problem. On the other hand, using I statements can seem more empathetic and hurt. The other partner doesn't feel like they are the only ones with the problem. I statements also mean that the partner also shares the blame and is therefore open to discussing it. You know, I take responsibility for myself. You see what I'm saying? What I did in the relationship when I'm speaking to you. I acknowledge that I'm not giving you the time that you need. I acknowledge that I exploded and I have an issue these days with the way I'm communicating with you. I'm communicating with anger. Is I taking responsibility for myself versus pointing out the other person what they're doing wrong. We're talking about being careful of how we break the communication. That doesn't mean that there's not a time to discuss the problems that the other person, has. But we have to make sure that we, in our minds, we're in control with how it is that we're communicating with the other person. So that we're able to create the environment that the other person feels heard, understood, loved, you connect with them. So when you get to those hardcore issues, when people have to take responsibility other than yourself for the behavior or the speech or whatever it may be, that can be done in a way that's respectful and civilly. And so with that, we end, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh wa nastaghfirullah wa natubu ilayh. So next week we deal with the signs your communication is good, or bad. Yeah. And then that's finishing chapter 4, and then chapter 5 is building a deeper connection.